please join me in welcoming our dignitaries, and we are grateful for your presence and look forward to your valuable insights and contributions for today's event, sir. So to start our lecture today, we'll start it with our CA motto song and Tamil Taiwan.
सुप्तेषु जाग्रति य एष सुप्तेषु जाग्रति कामं 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 कामुषो पुरुषो निर्विमाणः निर्विमाणः हरेर् शुक्रं हरेर् शुक्रब्रह्मा तद्ब्रह्मा तदेवामृतमुच्यते तस्मिन् लोकः शिवः सर्वे तदूनात्यपि कश्चनात्यपि कश्चन एतद्वैता 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 एतद्वैता.
நிலமடந்தை கெழிதொழுகும் சீராரும் மதனமென திகழ்வரத கண்டனிலும் அதில் சிறந்த திராவிடனல் திருநாடும் தக்க சிறு திரை முதலும் தரித்தனல் திலகமுமே அத்திலக வாசனை போல் அனைத்துலகும் இன்பமுற எத்திசையும் புகழ் மணக்க இருந்த பெரும் தமிழனங்கே தமிழனங்கே உன் சீரிழமை திறந்தியந்து செயல் மறந்து வாழ்த்துதுமே வாழ்த்துதுமே.
And I'd also request Mr. Venkatraman to please join us on the dais, please, sir. CAI. It's a proud moment to inform the members and people present here today that ICAI is going to host its World Forum of Accountants on 31st January to 2nd February at Delhi. So we will be playing a small awareness short video so that you will be able to carry this information across for people to actively participate in this event.
The world's largest accountancy body, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, is all set to host one of the biggest congregations for accounting and finance professionals, ICAI World Forum of Accountants 2025, a global platform to share insights, explore emerging trends and shape the future of the accountancy profession with the transformative power of AI to build a sustainable planet. Join us at this 3-day mega event from January 31st to February 2nd, 2025. The world's largest accountants.
So, on behalf of ICAI, I request Sundarajan sir to invite our guests and adorn them with a shawl. So we wanted to invite the guests with a shawl. It's okay, fine. I think I will request the guests to first pay our floral tributes to Sankar Aiyar. and light the lamp, and then we'll proceed. Let's request the dignitaries to lamp the light.
शुक्ला ब्रह्म विचार सार परमा पुस्तक धारिणी महयना हस्ते स्फाटिक मालिका मृदधसी वेदां परमेश्वरी भगवती बुद्धिप्रदां शारदा
Thank you, sir. Forward, I request Tirumani Sankar Aiyar sir to give his special address.
Should I do it afterwards? Should I do it afterwards?
Welcoming the guests now, I think I request Manishankar Aiyar sir to kindly invite the guests with an unrolling of a shawl and a memento from SIRC.
My honor to get the second time. Very nice. Last one, just to hold. This is from Mailaduthura.
Thank you, sir. So, I am proud to announce that I stand here representing SIRC for the 17th Memorial, Shri Sankar Aiyar Memorial Lecture, which started from 2008. And Sankar Aiyar, who had hailed from Karakudi village in Tanjavur district of Tamil Nadu, was a partner of Aiyar & Co in Lahore. And late Sankar Aiyar had shifted to Delhi in the year of 1946 and had started his own practice as a proprietor of a CA firm till 1952. After that, he retired from the profession and had become religious and had entrusted his practice and goodwill of that firm to 3 of his colleagues who had continued his practice in partnership and continued the profession. So we in SIRC are proud that this lecture or this memorial lecture was started in SIRC since 2008, and it is notable. It is to note that the first memorial lecture instituted in the name of a member of the institute by ICAI, after which was then followed by S. Vaidinath Aiyar Memorial Lecture and PP Guru Raj Upadhyaya Memorial Lecture. So we in SIRC, sir, were very proud that this was one of the most first constituted memorial lecture, and it was SIRC's proud moment that we were the host for this lecture. So on behalf of SIRC and on behalf of the Sankar Aiyar family team, I request our chief dignitary today, Chief Guest Subba sir, to address the gathering. And I think a brief profile of Subba sir, if I'll have to read. Many among the participants today would know him. And I would request if Mani Sankar Aiyar sir would want to add a few words on that, to invite him to the lecture. So, please.
Today is the fulfillment of a long dream. It was several years ago that Mr. Venkatraman, who's sitting on the stage, suggested to me that we ask the former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Dr. Subba, IAS, to give one of the Sankar Aiyar Memorial lectures. For various reasons, although we had contacted him, it turned out not to be possible until today. So I'm very, very happy to welcome Dr. Subba to this forum, and he will be addressing us on a subject of very great concern at the present juncture. Why is that? What is the present juncture? The present juncture is one in which, after having postponed the census of India for several decades, we now seem to be on the edge of a census in just about a year from now, in 2026. And it is expected, because some of the information about our population spread is well known, that we will be seeing a situation in which the population of the north of India has grown much faster than the population of the south of India. And since our democratic system is based on a one-man, one-vote principle, and since the distribution of finances from the center is to some extent based upon this distribution of population, it is likely that the southern states of India will find themselves politically weakened by the outcome of the next census and economically disadvantaged. So the question that Dr. Subba has asked himself and is going to answer today is a very vital one. Is India's fiscal federalism loaded against the states? India's federalism, if you merely look at the state list and the union list in the Constitution, is loaded heavily in favor of the states, because the tasks to be undertaken by the states is very numerous, and the tasks to be undertaken by the center is relatively very small. There's also a concurrent list, but there are not too many items on it. And here in Tamil Nadu in particular, there is considerable objection to the union list at all. So in these circumstances, if the load of responsibility on the south, on the states, comes from the Constitution, but the Constitution does not prescribe how the revenues of the nation are to be distributed between the states. That is a decision taken from time to time by the Finance Commission. Then have we got into a position where India's fiscal federalism is loaded against the states? And to answer this highly critical question well on time, before decisions are taken on the basis of the forthcoming census, Dr. Subba has kindly agreed to, in effect, initiate this national debate, which is going to overwhelm us within the next year or two. And we must never forget, and the Sankar Aiyar Commission report draws our attention to it, that because the US Constitution was too rigid when regarding differences between the southern states of the United States and the northern states of the United States of America reached a kind of peak around 1860. They were unable to resolve the differences between the South and the North, and it resulted in a civil war, which was the worst bloodletting that humanity had known until 1860 to 1865. And that was only exceeded by the First World War and then the Second World War. So we are in a very delicate political position regarding the unity of India. And if the unity of India is to be preserved, then Dr. Subba Rao's question, which he is himself going to answer, is of vital significance for this country and its future. At the same time, I cannot think of anyone better suited to ask or answer this question than Dr. Subba Rao, because he came into the Indian Administrative Service some 9 years after I did, in a very distinguished position, and his early promise was fulfilled throughout his career, which was climaxed by his becoming the Finance Secretary of India just before the second term as Prime Minister of Dr. Manmohan Singh. And he remained in that position till that point. So he was very much involved with the implementation of the reforms process that had been started in 1991. And then he reached the real climax of his career when he was made the Governor of the Reserve Bank in 2008. And for 5 years thereafter, that is virtually the totality of UPA 2, he was the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. And usually, the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India very quickly finds himself in opposition to the Finance Secretary of the Government of India. But since Dr. Subba Rao had, in a sense, graduated from being Finance Secretary to becoming the Governor, his period was marked by harmony between the Reserve Bank of India and the Finance Ministry. That appears to have recently come under considerable strain, if one is to believe newspaper reports about the last 3 Reserve Bank governors, Raghuram Rajan, Urjit Patel, and now Shaktikant Das. So he has seen the economy as an IAS officer from the grassroots. He's also guided the economy as the Finance Secretary at a crucial period in our economic growth, and then he has supervised at a macro level the growth of the economy and the integration between monetary and fiscal policy as the Governor of the Reserve Bank. And so I can think of no one more qualified to ask the question before us, before the House today, than Dr. Subba Rao. And frankly, I can think of no one better to answer that question than Dr. Subba Rao. So ladies and gentlemen, I present the former Reserve Bank of India Governor. Thank you.
Good evening. It's wonderful to be here in Chennai, being hosted by the ICAI South India chapter, meeting many of my friends and colleagues from the IAS, from the RBI, and most of all, delighted to deliver the Sankar Aiyar Memorial lecture. When Shri Mani Sankar Aiyar invited me to give this lecture, he suggested that I address, as he just told us, address a topic in the broad domain of fiscal federalism. So after some reflection, I decided on this topic, is India's fiscal federalism loaded against its states? That sounded interesting, intriguing, even provocative. But identifying the topic was the easy part. When I started thinking through, fleshing it out, organizing my thoughts, I felt challenged. The reason is that I left the IAS 15 years ago. I left the Reserve Bank 10 years ago. In these years, the world has moved on, India has moved on, fiscal federalism has moved on, new challenges, new opportunities, new problems, new solutions, new concepts, new ideas, whereas I've stayed back. So do I have anything substantive to say? These days, if I have to address a substantive topic, my escape route is to tell stories. So I'm going to tell you a story. Throw your mind back 30 years, mid-1990s, when Devagowda had become Prime Minister. Those of you who are old enough will remember that Devagowda became Prime Minister with the support of Chief Ministers. So Chief Ministers, after having anointed him as Prime Minister, demanded their pound of flesh. They said, Delhi, give us more money. So Devagowda did what any seasoned politician would do. He appointed a committee. Under the chairmanship of then Home Minister Indrajit Gupta, there were 3 other cabinet ministers on the committee, including Finance Minister Chidambaram, Deputy Chairman Planning Commission Pranab Mukherjee, and there were 8 chief ministers, including our Chief Minister Chandrababu Naidu. The remit of the committee was to determine how much of its share the central government should give to the states. The minimum amount the central government must give to the states. So if the central government, for example, collected 100 rupees as tax, how much minimum should it give? 37 rupees, 38 rupees, 42 rupees, whatever that was. Chief ministers had a ball. One chief minister said, why does the central government need money? Give it to us, we can spend it better. Another chief minister said, give us 55% because we know the people, we know the priorities. Another chief minister said, give us 65%, why does the central government need money? Another chief minister said, give us 75%, they're wasting money, we can spend it better. So the higher the chief minister pitched, the more heroic he became. And this committee, like any other government committee, evolved into subcommittees, sub-subcommittees, etc. So after 8 months of several meetings, there was more disagreement between the centre and states than when we started. I remember the last meeting of this committee on a Saturday afternoon in Vignan Bhavan. There were 4 central ministers, 8 chief ministers, and the meeting went as per expected line, very acrimonious, went all over the map. Chief ministers very stridently demanding that the centre must give money, and central ministers urging restraint. When we went all over the map, the meeting became very agitated. After about 3 hours, Home Minister Indrajit Gupta, he was exasperated. So he said, told the chief ministers, please listen to me. We've heard you. We know states need money, but the centre also needs money. So please use restraint, please be reasonable. That appeal seemed to have had an effect. Over the next 15 minutes, a consensus evolved. They agreed that the centre must give at least 50% to states. Everybody agreed, except one man, our Chief Minister Chandrababu Naidu. So he looked at the sky, he looked at the floor, he looked at his watch, looked out the window, he wouldn't talk. And the entire meeting was willing him to agree so that we'd have a deal. So again, he looked at the ceiling, looked at the floor, he looked out the window, looked into space, he turned to me. I was sitting next to him. He said, we were conversing in Telugu. What he asked me was, what should I do? I said, sir, we had our say. 50% is much more than we expected, so I think you should agree. We were conversing in Telugu, but everybody must have thought that I was the villain of the piece, telling him not to agree, because he was still stared into the space. I want you to understand the configuration of that meeting. There was the central ministers along one table, there was a horseshoe table around that where chief ministers sat along with one officers of theirs. Andhra Pradesh, alphabetically first, was at one end of that horseshoe table. West Bengal, alphabetically last, only alphabetically last, was at the other end of the table. And then in that pin drop silence, Jyoti Basu was Chief Minister of West Bengal. He got up. Everybody thought he was going to the bathroom, but instead of going to the exit, he started walking around the table, negotiating, tripping over toes. So, because there were people in the back rows, it took him about a minute and a half to negotiate his way from West Bengal to Andhra Pradesh. He came around the table. And as he came to us, I got up from my chair to offer my seat to him, but he pushed me down with one hand. He put his other hand on Chandrababu Naidu's shoulder and said, look Babu, we had a say. We said what we had to, but the central ministers are saying that the centre also needs money. This is the time to take a big picture view, take a nationalistic view. I leave it to you. So without waiting for Chandrababu Naidu to respond, Jyoti Basu started walking back towards West Bengal. Within about 10 seconds of that, our man agreed, nodded his head, and there was jubilation in the room. So we had a deal, so we packed up and adjourned for our well-earned tea. Nothing came of that meeting because the Devagowda government collapsed a week after that. I don't think they even recorded the minutes of that meeting. The reason I'm telling you that story is it is an illustration of the cooperative federalism and a political view politicians took at that time. 2 years ago, in 2022, the central government slashed excise duties on petrol and diesel, and quite obviously they went to the rooftops to advertise that, what they were doing to help people against inflation. And I'd read in the papers, I don't know, but there was, I believe, a meeting of the Prime Minister with Chief Ministers where he's reported to have chided non-BJP Chief Ministers for not reducing VAT, because following what the centre had done, BJP governments in states had reduced VAT on petrol and diesel. He chided non-BJP government Chief Ministers for not following suit. The non-BJP Chief Ministers hit back at the PM saying that petrol and diesel prices are high, not because of our VAT, but because the central government continues to collect high cess and surcharge. That's why prices are high, so you cut that first before talking to us. That is an illustration of combative or confrontational federalism. So this transition from cooperative federalism, Jyoti Basu type, and the confrontational federalism of 2022 is part of a long evolution of our federalism. To set the context for my further remarks, I want to spend about 3 minutes giving you my own understanding of the evolution of a federalism. If we take go back last 75 odd years since independence, I believe our federalism can be divided into 3 phases. The first phase, what I call a period of docile federalism, running from the time of independence up until the early 1970s, was docile federalism because both the political and economic space were completely dominated by the central government. Remember, at that time, both the centre and states were ruled by one party, the Congress Party. Pandit Nehru, who was Prime Minister, was seen as a national figure, not as a party personality or a political person, but as a national figure. Both Pandit Nehru and Home Minister Sardar Patel used to write letters to chief ministers on issues of national importance. In the economic dimension, the centre completely dominated. The central government decided through the Planning Commission what states spent, how much they spent, on what they spent. There was no private investment, not much of private investment. To the extent there was, the central government decided through the license permit regime where they should invest. And central government also did public enterprise investment, NTPC, BHEL, sale plans. So the central government dominated the political and economic spaces, and states acquiesced in that. That I would call is docile federalism. The second phase, running from the early 1970s up until the mid-90s, is what I call a period of cooperative federalism. In the political dimension, regional parties had come up. They were winning elections, coming into office at the state level. Article 356 was being invoked to dismiss state governments which rankled states. So the political space got a bit contentious. But the economic space was still cooperative because there was broad endorsement for the socialist philosophy, broad endorsement for the idea that the central government must spend to develop backward regions and backward people. So on balance, that period I believe was cooperative federalism. The third phase, running from the mid-90s to the current period, I would say is a period of confrontational, combative federalism. Remember, the mid-90s was the beginning of the time when the economic reforms in 1991 started taking root. We had amended the constitution to give constitutional status to local bodies. So that period in the political dimension, regional parties started having influence not only at the state level but even at the central level. They were coalition partners of some of the central governments. And some of the central government, UPA and NDA governments, depended on regional parties for their parliamentary majority, as indeed is the present NDA-3 government. And now, the economic clout of the central government diminished, if not totally disappeared. Why? Planning Commission has been abolished, so the central government can no longer tell states where to spend, how to spend. Private investment is delicensed, so private sector can go and invest wherever they want. Much of the investment that goes, much of the money that goes is to the Finance Commission, but that is formula driven. Private players have come into the financial sector. So, both in the political space and in the economic space, the central has lost clout. One broad narrative that has emerged out of this third phase of fiscal federalism is the view, according to states, that the terms of fiscal federalism have moved or loaded against states. If you want to expand that, a stylized version of that state's grievance is this. States say first, our expenditure responsibility, as Mr. Aiyar just pointed out, our expenditure responsibilities are much larger than the taxes we can raise on our own. Number two, the central government does not give us enough money to meet our expenditure needs. Number three, even the money that the center gives us, we don't have autonomy how to spend. And most importantly, they don't even allow us to borrow as much as we want. That's a stylized version. I have here an article of 6th December, just 3 weeks ago, written by Tamil Nadu Chief Minister Stalin in the Hindu, giving one version of this story. I believe that this contention of states is debatable. In order to carry forward that debate, I just want to spend 5 minutes giving the big picture of the center-state fiscal space. As Shri Sankar Aiyar pointed out in his remarks, our constitution lays down the expenditure responsibilities and the taxation powers of the center and states very clearly. That was not done arbitrarily. That was not done randomly. That was done with a lot of thought had gone into it. In fact, the division of responsibilities between the center and state, where the center can spend, where the states have to spend, where the center can tax, where states have to tax, that constitutional division is done consistent with what economists call the principle of subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity says that more buoyant taxes should be given to the central government and less buoyant taxes must be given to state governments or sub-national governments. Similarly, when it comes to expenditure, the principle of subsidiarity says that expenditures that have an impact on people's everyday lives, like education, health, law and order, they must be given to states. Expenditures which have economies of scale at the national level, like national security, defense, external trade, must be given to the central governments. This is a textbook principle that has withstood the test of time across several countries. So the constitutional division of responsibilities between the centre and states is consistent with the principle of subsidiarity. When our constitution makers made this division, they realized that there is a gap between what taxes states can generate and the expenditures they have to make. So the obvious solution to meet this structural gap is for the central government to give money. So the mechanism for that was a finance commission, which is in the constitution, written into the constitution, that a finance commission will be appointed once every 5 years to decide how much the central government must give to the states and how that pool of taxes which is given to the states must be distributed. So for example, as I said, if the finance commission decides that 41 rupees out of every 100 rupees must be given to the states, that is the vertical share, 41. How that 41 must be distributed across states is the horizontal share. It is the job of the Finance Commission, which is a political body, to determine both the vertical sharing and the horizontal sharing. Over time though, several other mechanisms of resource transfers from the centre to state have come up. Although only the Finance Commission is constitutionally ordained, there are, over time, other avenues have opened up. For example, most importantly, the Planning Commission was established. The Planning Commission decided on state plans. States had to go to this Planning Commission, get their plans approved, and after the plans have been approved, the central government gave them loans and grants to spend on that. That's quite substantial amounts. So that was the second route by which centre transferred money. This is not constitutionally ordered. This is an additional thing that the central government had started giving. Then there were centrally sponsored schemes, like for example, malaria eradication, or midday meal in schools, or employment guarantee. Central government had given money to states to spend on centrally sponsored schemes because these are national priorities. That thinking that if we leave it to states, they may not spend enough. So we want to signal national priorities. So central government sometimes gave money on a matching basis, saying that we'll give you 60%, you match 40%, sometimes 70-30, sometimes central government gave the full amount. They were the centrally sponsored schemes. And over the last 25 years, the central government has also been giving money to fund local bodies, urban local bodies and rural local bodies, which are not written into the original constitution. This is something that the central government had taken on, an obligation subsequently. Those are the four routes of transfers from the centre to states that you would find in the account books. Many chartered accountants here, if you look at public accounts, you will find them. But there are also hidden transfers that go from centre to states. For example, you take the minimum support price for rice and wheat. Minimum support price, who does it benefit? It benefits farmers who have a marketable surplus. So states where there is a marketable surplus of rice or wheat get more central transfers because the farmers have a marketable surplus. If a state does not have much of a marketable surplus, it doesn't get the money through MSP. When I was Finance Secretary of Andhra Pradesh, we had done a study. I'm talking about 30 years ago, I'm quite old. So we done a study and found that the MSP for wheat had increased proportionately faster over the last 15 years than for rice. What does that mean? That means that states which had a marketable surplus of wheat gained more than states which had a marketable surplus of rice, which had gained more than states which had no marketable surplus at all. Another avenue for hidden transfers, external funding, World Bank funding, ADB funding, Japan funding, all this is directed by the central government, and they can nudge them to go to Tamil Nadu or go to Punjab or go to Tripura. Then there is public investment in infrastructure, roads, ports, airports. So what I'm trying to say is that there are other ways, not deliberately hidden, but not showing up in the account books, by which central transfers go to states. If you look at the sum total of transfers from the center to states, through the Finance Commission, through the other routes, you will get the 60-40 picture. The 60-40 picture is this. If you take the combined tax pool of the center and states, the central government collects 60% of the taxes, and state governments collect 40%. If you take the combined expenditure of the center and states together, the center gets to spend 40 rupees, states spend 60 rupees, inverted. That's the 60-40 picture, because the central government collects as much as 60% of the total taxes, but gets to spend only 40%. The states, which collect only 40% of the taxes, get to spend 60% of the total expenditure. That's the 60-40 picture that you see. So with this 60-40 picture in view, let's come back to the original topic, which is the terms of fiscal federalism are loaded against states. The first point I want to make, actually I'm going to make 7 arguments depending on the 7 types of flows. The first one, center-state expenditure. That 60-40 picture I gave. States in India spend 60% of the combined expenditure. That as a proportion is larger than in other federations, as you see those numbers there. Indian states spend as much as 63.9%, whereas Brazil, Indonesia, Australia, US, large federal countries, where states or subnational units spend proportionately less. What does this mean? In a democracy, more spending means more political clout. So states in India have relatively more political clout than subnational units in other large federations. And we also know, and Mr. Sankar Aiyar knows better than most of us, politicians know that if you spend, you get votes. If you tax, you lose votes. So what's happening in India? States have the privilege of spending with pleasure of spending without the pain of taxation. So that's the first advantage states in India have. Let me go back to this. Then take the second argument, which is tax devolution. We noted that there is a finance commission whose job it is to determine what proportion of the tax pool the center must give to states. Originally, as per the original constitutional provision, states were entitled to share only in 2 central taxes, personal income tax and union excise duties. They were not entitled to a share in other taxes like customs or corporate tax, etc. States had a grievance against that. They protested for several years. So in the year 2000, the constitution was amended to give states a share in the total tax pool of the center, so that they get a benefit of the buoyancy of the total tax pool of the states. That is an additional advantage that states got through an amendment of the constitution. Third point, greater autonomy in spending. As I said a few minutes ago, there was the planning commission. States had to go to the planning commission, get their plans approved, according to which the central government gave loans and grants to states, decided that you must spend here on this irrigation, on that power project. with the result that states had no autonomy, or at least had limited autonomy. But with the abolition of the Planning Commission, the monies that were going tied for certain schemes are now coming untied unconditionally. States now have greater autonomy. So what is the sum total of this picture? The sum total of this picture is that states in India enjoy larger spending power and therefore larger political clout. Their share in the total tax pool has gone up. They're getting a larger share out of a larger pool, and that share has been growing, and they also have greater autonomy on spending. So decidedly, if anything, the terms of fiscal federalism have moved towards the states rather than against them. Let me move on. Let's take funding for local bodies. The constitution was amended. Mr. Sankar Aiyar was an intellectual force in much of those reforms. The constitution was amended, 73, 74th amendments to the constitution, giving constitutional status to local bodies, urban local bodies, rural local bodies. The understanding, the expectation when the constitution was amended was that states would give money to the local bodies. But most states did not honor that obligation. Now, one thing funny about decentralization is everybody wants decentralization only to their level. The Prime Minister says, I can't give money to Chief Minister, they will waste it. Chief Ministers say, I can't give money to Jilla Parishad Chairman, they'll waste it. Jilla Parishad Chairman say, I can't give money to Panchayat President, they'll waste it. So everybody wants decentralization to their level and no lower. So states reneged on that obligation. So the central government took on the obligation of funding local bodies. Of course, they give money to states which then pass on the money to states. But the central government had taken an obligation to fund local bodies, and how much each state gets is determined by the constitutionally appointed Finance Commission. And since 2000, over the last 25 years, central government has been giving increasingly large shares to the state governments for passing on to local bodies, urban and rural local bodies. Take centrally sponsored schemes. As I said earlier, centrally sponsored schemes are for the central government to signal national priorities. But states had several grievances. First thing they said, these, you're spending on education, you're spending on health, these are our subjects. So by spending on centrally sponsored schemes, you're wading into states' territory. States also said, give us the money, we know how to spend, we know the priorities. Why do you want to straitjacket schemes and give us the money? Just give us the money. Reasonable requests. If you're putting your daughter through college and you're contractually obligated to give her money for her tuition and her living, and then you decide that your daughter must take a course, a class in communication skills, because communication is very important. So you give her additional money and say, look, I'm giving you this additional money, take a class in communication. Your daughter turns back and says, no, communication, no, I want to learn to play tennis. So I want to spend this money on tennis. So you as the father tell her, or the mother, you tell her, look, if you want to learn to play tennis, you save money out of your pocket money and learn. But I'm giving this money only for improving your communication skills, take it or leave it. That is the way central and states are poised now. Central government says, we're giving this money because we believe this is national priority. States say, no, give us the money unconditionally. And if the center gives the money unconditionally, the daughter learns neither tennis nor communication skills, she spends it all partying away. And that's happened, okay? So that's the reality of the situation. The central government's argument is this, that look, we give money for centrally sponsored schemes under Article 282 of the Constitution. Article 282 of the Constitution allows both the central government and state governments to spend on any public purpose which may not necessarily be in their domain. Okay? So in addition to what you do, you can spend your money on other things if you want to. So central government has always maintained that we're giving this to you under Article 282, so this is not violative of the Constitution. We're giving this to you because it is national priority, take it or leave it. But that is an argument that's yet to be settled. Take the GST. We hailed this when GST was introduced in 2016. We hailed this as a significant reform, transformative reform. There was a special session of the Parliament to initiate the GST, very historic occasion. States have always had a grievance against this. Even today they have a grievance. Their main argument is that they look upon the GST as a national project or a central government project which has been thrust upon them. So they argue that, look, we have lost the autonomy, we have lost the power, we have lost the sovereignty to set the tax rates. That's gone away. But that, I think, is a short-sighted or misinformed view. Yes, states have lost their authority to set taxes, but so has the central government. GST rates are now set by the GST Council, where both the centre and states are members. And in a national project like this, some give and take is necessary, inevitable. But it is a win-win situation. So already we're seeing the benefits of GST, both the centre and states are going to benefit. So I believe it is short-sighted for the states to see the GST as a central initiative that's been thrust upon them. The last one, possibly the most ticklish, is the limits on how much states can borrow. Under Article 293 of the Constitution, states in India cannot borrow without the permission of the central government as long as they're indebted to the central government. There is no state for the next 25 years that will not be indebted to the central government. So every state will continue to be indebted to the central government for the next 25 years or beyond. So if states have to borrow, they need to take the central government's permission. And the central government can, according to the constitutional provision, impose certain conditions when they give that permission. It has rankled states quite a lot. And the government of Kerala has in fact gone to the Supreme Court, agitated this issue. It's pending before the Supreme Court now. Some of you might recall that it's been in the newspapers. This is a constitutional provision. Most states think that it is some machination of Prime Minister Nehru or Prime Minister Indira Gandhi or Prime Minister Vajpayee or Prime Minister Narendra Modi. No, no, no. It's written into the Constitution, this provision to give permission. Actually, in most, excuse me, yeah. Okay, sorry, I don't have. In most other countries, federations, states are not allowed to borrow, period, they're not allowed to borrow. In some other countries, states have to balance their budgets. In America, for example, states can borrow only for capital projects. They have to balance their budget. Additionally, they can borrow only for capital projects. In India, states can borrow for anything. They have the power. When they go to Mumbai and borrow in the markets, it's not like they have to spend on giving salaries or spending on irrigation or spending on a midday meal program. It is unattached, untied. So states in India can borrow for any purpose. They borrow a much larger proportion than states in many other countries. And states are also able to borrow at a lower cost than they would be able to borrow had they gone on their own. Because the central government controls, administers borrowing by the states, states are able to borrow at a lower cost. They don't realize that. Okay? That's a hidden advantage they enjoy. And I also want to say this, that although there is a constitutional provision for the central government to impose conditions while giving that permission, they have never ever imposed any conditions. So the point is that there are limits on borrowing by states because India is one fiscal entity. If government of Telangana, where I live, if that state becomes profligate, it's not a problem of Telangana alone. They spill over into other states, the entire country. So India is one fiscal entity. We cannot have one state going overboard because it pulls down every other state. That's why there is need for prudential control over state governments. So you might think that I'm biased against the central government in arguing that the terms of fiscal federalism are biased against states. In order to prove my credentials, I want to tell you that the central government is not blameless. They need to inform, they need to take certain initiatives. And I want to give you some examples. One is the central government levies cesses and surcharges over and above taxes. All of your income tax payers, all of your chartered accountants here, if you pay 1 lakh of income tax, you pay what, 5,000, 10,000 rupees of surcharge on that, right? You pay a surcharge on your income tax. Why does the central government not collect that as a tax but collect that as a surcharge? The reason is that if it is collected as a tax, they have to share with the states. If it is collected as a surcharge, they don't have to share with the states. For example, if the central government collects 100 rupees and the finance commission says you give away 40 rupees, 100 rupees the center gives away 40 rupees, they get to keep 60. On the other hand, if they collect 80 rupees as tax and 20 rupees as surcharge, they need to give away only 60% of 80 rupees. 40% of 80 rupees with 32 rupees. And they get to keep 68 rupees. So it is to the centre's advantage to collect cesses and surcharges rather than taxes. In fact, one of the arguments Chief Minister Stalin makes in this is that the amount of tax or the amount of money that the central government is collecting via cesses and surcharges is growing every year. You are denying the states a share. Actually, in order to deny the states a share, you are collecting more and more money via cesses and surcharges. I believe the central government's argument is that we're collecting this money because we have to fund local bodies, we have to fund CSS, we're giving this money back to you. But I believe there is a case for the central government to exercise some restraint, put a ceiling on how much they can collect through cess and surcharge. The centrally sponsored schemes. Here again, I believe there is a case for the center to consult states. For example, one of the centrally sponsored schemes is training of bamboo weavers. Many states said, we have no bamboo weavers in our state. So how do we spend that money? Give that money for a scheme that is relevant to us. So I believe that there is an argument that the central government must consult states in the design of the centrally sponsored schemes. Second, they must have a menu of schemes from which the states can choose instead of saying that this is the thing and we give it to you. And third, there is a need to periodically review the centrally sponsored schemes. The third on my list is freebies, and I have a strong view on this. I was quite there is an increasing tendency to make transfer payments, subsidies, free transfers to people. One state gives 2,000 rupees to every woman, one state gives 3,000 rupees to every auto driver. Okay? This is competitive populism. Both the center and states are guilty. All political parties are guilty. I don't want to single out anyone as non-guilty. Everybody is guilty. It is not even clear that these freebies are resulting in any political advantage. We just saw the Maharashtra election. There have been every sort of comment. Some commentators said that the Mahayuti won because of the Ladki Bahan scheme. Another commentator said the MBA offered even more, so they should have won if that was the vote getter. Another commentators said, actually people have seen through this. The political parties are neutralizing each other. And someone else said, what's the point giving this money? Inflation is going up. Indeed, inflation is going up today, partly because of these transfer payments. So we need to rethink this. I'm aware that in a poor society like ours, where millions struggle for a decent livelihood every day, there is need to make transfer payments. But that's got to be limited. There's got to be some restraint. The reason is that these freebies are not being funded by taxes that the states earn or the central government earns. These freebies at the margin are being funded by borrowing. So if you borrow and spend money on current consumption, it is like borrowing money to party. How do you repay this? As the finance minister said, some of you must have seen a statement this morning, the finance minister said that if you keep on borrowing like this, you're passing on the burden of borrowing to our next generation. We're actually sinning against our children by borrowing and spending for current consumption. So I believe there's got to be a restraint. No political party, no single state government will offer to come forward and say that we're going to adopt a self-disciplined approach. There is need for the central government to take the leadership on this and develop an accepted code of conduct across state governments and across political parties. The last thing I want to say, which is quite simple, is that today there is no platform for the centre and states to discuss. There used to be the Planning Commission, at least there used to be the Planning Commission, there used to be meetings between the centre and the states, but those are all so politically state managed. They were, states chief ministers read out their statements, and sometimes they walked out to make a political statement. They walk out, make more news than what was discussed in the meeting. Then the Niti Aayog today holds meetings, but again those are very, very stage managed meetings. Nobody listens to anyone. People just read out their statement. There's much acrimony. There is, I believe, need for a platform where meetings are held in camera, across political parties, where the centre and state discuss issues of national importance, issues of governance in a dispassionate, political manner. So, what I've said so far, summarize, I talked about the three phases of the evolution of our federalism. I talked about the constitutional division of responsibilities between the centre and states. The 60-40 big picture, how the fiscal center of gravity is shifting towards the states. The states' contention that the terms of fiscal federalism are moving against them. On the contrary, the terms of fiscal federalism are shifting in favor of states. Nevertheless, as I said, to show my credentials, there is need for the central government to take the leadership on certain national initiatives. Before I conclude, I suggest one thought experiment. I just want all of you spend just 20 seconds quietly thinking of India of your dreams. Just 20 seconds. Thank you. Not all of us can put that in words, but all of us can imagine the India of our dreams. India of our dreams is that it should be a happy, prosperous country, a harmonious society, looked up to by the world as a model citizen in the international community, where children are smart, their country lives by certain values, etc., the usual homily of lists. Now if I tell you, list out 4 or 5 things that need to be accomplished to realize the India of your dreams, again, that will be the usual suspects, right? We must improve education and health. We must become an innovative society. We must have religious harmony. We must generate jobs, skills, gender harmony. The usual suspects. It's very, very unlikely that in any of your lists, center-state cooperation would have figured. So what I want to tell you, the one idea that I want you to carry away from this lecture is that if you want to become a developed country, Viksit Bharat by 2047 as we want to, it is important. Center-state cooperation is vital, very, very necessary. You know, the first generation reforms that we carried out in 1991 and in the subsequent decades over the last 30 years, which involved liberalizing imports, investment, financial sector, they could be done by the central government without consulting the states. But the second generation reforms relating to land, labor, taxation, infrastructure building through public-private partnerships, we need not just the consent but even the cooperation of states. So we cannot become a developed country by 2047 unless there is cooperation between the center and states. So thank you very much once again. It's been wonderful, an opportunity for me to deliver the Sankar Aiyar Memorial lecture. I want to thank the ICAI and I want to thank everyone for listening to me. Thank you.
I request Manisha sir to give us thoughts. Welcome, sir.
Shri Soundarajan, Chairman, Dr. Subbarao and Mr. Venkataraman, and all my friends. Since this is a memorial occasion, the ICAI SIRC have decided that at each of these memorial lectures, I should bring to your attention my father, what he did, and why it is that we have this series of memorial lectures. I hardly knew my father. My mother and he didn't really get on. So I spent a lot of my infancy, my childhood, away from him. And then came partition. He was in Lahore, Pakistan, and we were in Shimla, India. And then we were able to meet here in Delhi, but he, for the first and only time in his life, went abroad for 3 months. And when he returned, he found that it was impossible to get a residence in Delhi. And the only way in which we could stay somewhere was by his contacting members from Madras, as it was called then, the members of the Constituent Assembly. So we first went to OV Irrigation, who kindly gave us one room in which 6 of us lived. And Amma discovered very quickly that with 6 of us living in a single room, it was not going to be possible to have her children educated. We had a very good time because we just played cricket the whole day, except for one terrible hour when the gentleman who was my father's favorite and was destined to become Venkataraman's father, he was given the job of teaching us Sanskrit. And his method of teaching us Sanskrit was to hold our ears and twist it. So I have the most dreadful memories of being taught Sanskrit by his father. So we were, once when my father went away to Bombay, we were literally kidnapped by my mother and taken to Dehradun, where we were put into boarding school. So I went into boarding school at the age of 7, my brother at the age of 6, and my youngest brother went into boarding school before he was 5 years old. And so we would see my father only during the holidays. But even then, because he traveled very extensively, it was only very occasionally. So in 1953, on the 10th of May, we were summoned, on the 9th of May, we were summoned by the headmaster who said that you are required to go to Delhi and we asked why, and he said, "You're going for a festival." And my youngest brother was in another school called Welham. So we were told that all three of us would be taken by the house captain to to Delhi for this festival. And on the way, the head boy, tried to tell us that we'd find things different when we arrived at home. But we didn't understand. So when I got there was a large crowd waiting to take me, and I was taken up to the third floor where we lived. And Amma was sitting on a white sheet. And one didn't know why everyone was looking mournful. And it took a little while for it to sink into me, but not into Mukundan, who was only 8 years old, that my father had died. And that evening, I had to go around his body and put some rice grains into his mouth and light the funeral pyre. And it was not until that happened that the reality got borne in on me that he was no more. And so I've had to discover who he was in the period after he passed away. And to do that, it began with his having been associated with the Birlas, with the Dalmias, as a chartered accountant. Now, how had he got to, of all places, Lahore? It began here in Chennai, where my father went to Pachiapas College at the same time as C.N. Anna. They both passed out in 1927. And while the prospect before Annadurai was a very bright one, because the Justice Party was dominant in Tamil Nadu, and they were running an anti-Brahmin movement. For my father, there was no prospect here, because he happened to be an Aiyar. So he took a train. He was very angry. He was a 20-year-old boy. He took a train and said he'd get off wherever it stopped. And it happened to stop in Lahore. And fortunately for him, there was a P&S Aiyar, whose firm called Aiyar & Company still exists. Does it? It does. So P&S Aiyar had set up Aiyar & Company in Lahore for the same reason. He too was, in a sense, driven out of here, or drove himself out of here. And my father and Vaidinath Aiyar joined that company as partners. And I mean, they were article clerks, and then they passed their exams. The whole firm became so influential in that part of India, which is today Pakistan, that when it came to the 14th of August, 1947, my father decided to become a Pakistani, because his clients were mostly in the area from Peshawar to Karachi, which fell in Pakistan. But 3 days later, he got his PhD in political science, because a grocer, a sabziwala, who was on the next street, told my father that this is a madness. It will all finish in a few days. You just put a big padlock on your door and you remain inside the house, and I'll see to it that at 3 o'clock in the night, I'll come and knock on your rear door, and you open it and I'll give you your day's supplies. And in about a week's time, this madness will end, and we can go back to being where we were for what in effect had been 20 years of my father's life. He'd gone to Lahore at the age of 20, and this was in 1947, when he was just about to enter middle age, at the age of 40. And it was perfectly normal for Hindus and Muslims to live together in Lahore. Indeed, Lahore city had a majority of Hindus and Sikhs, amounting to about 51%, and 49% were Muslims. But Lahore district was about 90% Muslim. And it turns out from history books that Jinnah was actually willing to surrender Lahore to India, provided we gave them Calcutta. And that was unacceptable to India, which is how Lahore became part of Pakistan and Calcutta remained in India. And into that place I was born. And how was I born? It was a very strange story. My mother was born in Trichy district, but her father, who was a Tahsildar, was transferred to what history had decided would be my constituency. So there's a village there called Shudamangalam, and he was posted as the Tahsildar in Papanasam district or Papanasam block, where the Shudamangalam village is. And his first wife died when giving birth to his fourth child. And so, left with 4 little children, he decided to marry again. In the meanwhile, his eldest daughter, who was his first child, he doted on her. Her name was Alankaram. He doted on her, but in accordance with the practice of those days, she was married at the age of 13, and her 18-year-old husband was studying medicine. So he, within 6 months of the marriage, fell ill and died. So Alankaram would have been a child widow in the village. And my grandfather, who had seen what happened to child widows, in fact to all widows in rural Tamil Nadu, they were all called Kamanatis. And the word had another association as well, because they were in such desperate plights that it was only by resorting to the oldest profession in the world that they could survive. So the words are the same for widow and the prostitute. So to save her from that fate, my grandfather was an enlightened man. He took her to Sister Subba, who was running a school in Chennai for widowed child widows, and he put her in that school. And from there, she went on to become one of the most distinguished medical practitioners in the country. And she won a prize of a set of Shakespeare books when she stood first at Lady Hardinge Medical College. And I am the proud possessor of that set of Shakespeare books now, because it was given to me. My mother, on the other hand, was left in the village, and she and her 2 brothers were effectively made into domestic servants when they were farmed out to members of the extended family, who in return for feeding and looking after them would make them do domestic chores of a very tiresome nature. There was no question of their being educated. But that was because my grandfather had married a second time to get the wife to look after the children. But he died in the great flu of 1918. So Amma became, while her elder sister became a child widow, she became an orphan. And she was therefore being farmed out to these families. When Sister Subba from Alankaram heard the story of her mother, of my mother, Sister Subba arrived up at the railway station called Pashupati Kovil, and near Pashupati Kovil is the village of Shudamangalam. So they arrived up at the house and they kidnapped my mother and took her to the railway station. But in those days, trains used to move very slowly. So when the train came from Tanjore to Pashupati Kovil, it stopped there for a long time. And in the meanwhile, the people who were using my mother as a domestic servant found that she'd been taken away, and they fetched up at the railway station and threatened to throw themselves in front of the train if my mother was not returned to them. But Sister Subba held my mother's arm firmly and told her she couldn't get off. And so when the train moved, wisely her guardian decided not to throw herself in front of the train. And Amma arrived up here, and she was put into Ice House, which is on the marina. Now, why she was put in Ice House, I don't really know. But since it's now become the center for the Vivekananda Center, I recall my mother telling me that she had received a scholarship of 5 rupees a month from somebody she called an Andhra Rani. And that Rani suddenly died. And then the Ramakrishna Mission picked up the 5 rupees, and she finished her schooling in Sister Subbalakshmi's school and got admitted to Queen Mary's College, where she got a BA in chemistry, and then she joined the Madras Education Service. Now the Madras province in those days was very extensive. It went all the way up to Behrampur in today's Odisha. So her first posting was to Visakhapatnam. And when she arrived as a 20-year-old woman in the Madras Education Service in Visakhapatnam, they didn't know what to do with her, because they had never had the experience of a 20-year-old woman who was unmarried and who had come as a professional and who had to find accommodation in a city that had never heard of working women's hostels. So they looked around and they found that the Vice Chancellor of Andhra University in Visakhapatnam had a large house but was effectively living the life of a bachelor. So they asked him whether they would take Amma in as a paying guest. And he kindly agreed. His name was Dr. S. Radhakrishnan. So eventually, this was going to turn out to be a crucial milestone in my own life, but more than 30 years later, or 40 years later. And I'll come to that in due course. So Amma became a teacher in Visakhapatnam. She was then transferred to Nellore. So she became fluent in Telugu. She also knew Malayalam, and she was deeply, deeply involved with Tamil and Tamil literature. And she reached the grand old age of 28, 29 without having a husband. So she then decided to do what lots of young people had to do at that age, which was to get themselves a degree from England so that they could, get promoted in India. So Amma decided that she would, to her licentiate of teaching, the LT, she would get herself a degree in England. But where was she to get the money? There was a gentleman here called Satyanathan, who became very famous because Satyanathan was the one who identified the OBCs, and the entire OBC reservation system is based upon the Satyanathan report. So Satyanathan and Amma became very close to each other because of their shared love of Tamil literature. And Satyanathan was a very wealthy man. And he gave Amma the money to go to England. So she bought a ticket on a Lloyd Tristino liner. That is that is an Italian liner to go to England. She set out in August of 1939, and her ship reached Suez on the 3rd of September when Hitler invaded Poland and started the Second World War. So as a British citizen, a British Indian citizen, on an Italian ship, and the Italians as part of the German Axis, all the Indians on board began wondering whether they should get off at Port Said when we arrived through the Suez Canal, or continue to Bari in Italy and then either be locked up for the whole of the war as an enemy alien, or whether they would be permitted to take a train to go to England. So Amma had spotted that there was an industrialist called Ambalal Sarabhai who was traveling in the first class. And she said that if Ambalal Sarabhai gets off at Port Said, I'll get off. And if he stays, then I'll stay on board. So she was in the deck class passengers, but she kept a firm eye on Ambalal. And when Ambalal got off at Port Said, she got off at Port Said. And then was taken and given refuge in an awful little port called Massawa in Eritrea, which is now in Eritrea. And then she was brought by a P&O liner from Eritrea back to the subcontinent. She arrived in Colombo. And from Colombo, she made her way by train and boat to Chennai. But by the time she arrived in Chennai, the trunk in which she had all her possessions had been stolen from her. And so she arrived back without a degree, without ever having seen the green island of England, and a huge debt on her hands, and her only possession was the sari in which she was standing. So her sister, who was in Delhi, told her that you better come here. And Amma then took a train to Delhi. And on the way, she was told that there are two stations at Agra. One is Raja Ki Mandi, the other is Agra Cantonment. And if a friend of Alalkaram's would meet her at Raja Ki Mandi, and if she felt comfortable with him, she could get off at Agra Cant and see the Taj Mahal. So when they arrived at Raja Ki Mandi, there was this chap about 5'2", slim, who got into the compartment. And Amma decided that she could handle him. So when they arrived in Agra Cant, she got off with him. And he first took her to the fort in Agra. And in the fort in Agra, there is a mirror that Aurangzeb put in, through which you could see the Taj Mahal. And this was to enable his incarcerated father, Shah Jahan, to be able to look at the Taj Mahal, where was buried his favorite wife, a lady called Mumtaz Mahal. So it was obligatory for all tourists to look at that mirror. But neither of them, neither my father nor my mother, were tall enough to be able to see it. So my father offered to pick my mother up. And for some strange reason, her recounting of the story ended always at this point. So I never got to know whether he picked her up or not, and what happened thereafter. But a few months later, they were married. And they were married in a very strange way. They were married in the bridegroom's house, because the bride had no house of her own. And the North Indians, whom my father called in, they didn't know in an Orthodox Brahmin house how to let these foreigners in. So there was a tent built for them, it was called the Shaukandi, and all the foreigners were put in there. And yesterday, as I was coming into Chennai, I noted that there were more North Indians, many more North Indians and foreigners in the plane than there were Tamils. So that's the way in which the country has got integrated over the years. But in consequence of that wedding, I was born in Lahore. And that's the story of how I got to Lahore. I've already told you that we had very little time with my father. But when he passed away and this series of talks was to begin, I researched a little bit, and I found that all the time from when he was in Lahore, he was attempting to bring the community of chartered accountants together. And it was therefore his efforts partly succeeded, partly didn't. But when independence came, partition took place, and he arrived in Delhi, he then contacted a lot of chartered accountants, and they started this Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. And Appa was a founder member, which is why I thought 50 years after he passed away that it would be appropriate to institute a lecture series in his memory. It didn't work out in Delhi, but thanks to Raja and his contacts with the institute, we were able to start the series in the Southern Indian Regional Council. And I am very deeply grateful to you, to my friend there, to all the others in this institute who for the last, since 2008, so that makes it 17 years, have been on an annual basis organizing this lecture. And we've succeeded in getting some of the finest minds in India into this lecture series, and therefore it's entirely appropriate that an absolutely superb mind like that of Dr. Subba should now be gracing us with his lecture. I'm very grateful to him for putting in place the dimensions of this business of whether they are loaded against the states or not. What I had hoped for, though, was that in addition to the vertical division that he was talking about, that we would get to hear about the horizontal division. Because the real problem does not come on the vertical division, where he has shown that 63.9% of our national resources are one way or the other being channeled to the states. What worries us, I think, is the division between the states. And to illustrate that, he quoted from an article by Chief Minister Stalin. I go a couple of weeks earlier, where another article appeared by a DMK spokesman, which said that for every rupee generated by Tamil Nadu, they get back 60 paise. But when it comes to Bihar, for every rupee of national revenue generated by Bihar, they get 3.60 rupees. That is the source of tension. That we do well, we give the country so much. There's so much industry here. There is so much generation of national wealth here. There's so much generation of national income here. But when it comes to the population shares, we get less per capita because we've done a very good job of keeping our birth rates down. And we kept our birth rates down because Kamarajar decided on the midday meal. And that scheme was picked up by the successor Dravidian governments. And we now have a really superb midday meal system, which means that parents don't have to worry about having additional hands on the farm in order to generate the additional income for themselves to eat, because eating is being looked after by the state. Is this a freebie, or is it a crucial contribution to the development of the nation? The Tamil Nadu model of birth control, population control, has now become very widespread. And all over the country we see that the midday meal scheme is functioning and it is contributing to a reduction in the birth rate in every city and in every state and in every community of India. So we have to evaluate, I think, the words of the economist as to whether development is about the economy or is it about human welfare. To what extent does the GDP and per capita income figure have to be reflected through the prism of things like public education, public health, public infrastructure, which are not paid for. And if one does that, then one realizes that we are entering a minefield. If you say that we'll do the census, which hasn't been done since 1971, only because if you did a census, the basis on which the horizontal division of national revenues takes place would be challenged, because the division is on a very sensible basis per capita, that all Indians are equal, and therefore if a particular state has a larger population, then it gets a larger share, and if you have a smaller population, you get a smaller share. But the end result of that is that if you are a good Indian and control the size of your family, you get discriminated against. So how can we be punished for our virtues and rewarded for our vices? How can we be punished for doing a better job of development than the North Indian states have done? And it brings us to that point which I was referring to in my opening remarks, which is the tension between the North and the South. I think no one should forget that the relationship between Tamil Nadu and Delhi is at least as sensitive as between Srinagar and Delhi. And why do I say this? One day it occurred to me to look up the old newspapers to find out what were the headlines on the day that I was born. That is the 10th of April 1941. And in America, I found I could buy the copy of the New York Herald Tribune on any day of the year. So I picked up the one on the 10th of April, and it said that Hitler had bombed Belgrade. So I came back to India and I looked it up, and it said that Periyar, E.V. Ramasamy Nayakar, had gone to the railway station to receive Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who had arrived in Chennai that morning, the previous day, in order to address a meeting of the All India Muslim League in 1941, after having adopted the resolution of March 23rd, 1940, which was the start of the Pakistan movement. And that Periyar, on the stage welcoming him, had said to him that I endorse your idea of Pakistan, but in exchange I want you to endorse my idea of a Dravidistan, that the southern states of India, who are comprised of Dravidian people as distinct from the Aryan people of the north, should also have the right to secede. And the Dravida Karaham on the social front and the Dravida Munnetra Karaham on the political front had made secession from the Indian Union the object of their politics from 1948, when Anna Durai formed the DMK, till 1962, when the Chinese invasion of India took place. And it was only in the wake of that invasion that he said, we are giving up our demand for secession, we'll remain part of India. But what happened? In 1965, we came to 15 years after the Constitution, and the Constitution had said that Hindi would be the sole language of the country. And there was an explosion here in Tamil Nadu. It resulted in the Congress being completely defeated in 1967. And ever since then, it is one or the other faction of the Dravidian movement that has been politically ruling the state. And they are so sensitive to the question of states' rights that the only parties to oppose the constitution amendment bills with which I was connected, the Panchayati Raj bills, were the DMK who voted against and the ADMK that abstained. Otherwise, every party in the country voted in favor. So that is the degree of sensitivity which we have to understand. And yet, it was not M.K. Stalin, but Chandrababu Naidu, who as the Chief Minister of a rump Andhra Pradesh, announced that if this discrimination against the South is going to continue, I am going to ask my people and incentivize them to increase the birth rate. And Stalin, a day later, said the same thing. So the major achievement of India, where Indira Gandhi had said the best contraceptive is development. That was the statement she made in Stockholm. And it was being proved right in southern India. We are now finding that in order to retain our political and economic space in this country, we'll have to reverse our biggest achievement, which is controlling the birth rate. Now, is that desirable, either from the state's point of view or from the nation's point of view? Or should we devise some other method by which the better off states or the better performing states are not punished for their better performance, and the worst performing states are not rewarded for being laggards? That is the existential choice before this country. It's coming in 2026, and it's coming in the same way as the question of slavery came up in the United States in 1860, where Abraham Lincoln won the nomination for the Republican Party because he was the most moderate on the question of slavery. He's the most moderate. And yet, he was left with no alternative but to go into a civil war, saying a house divided against itself cannot stand. And despite the Constitution of the United States being somewhat more confederal than federal, and therefore the forces of the southern states called themselves the Confederal forces. So it was the Confederation of the United States that went to war with the Federation of the United States. Now, do we want a confederation of southern states to go to war against the federal states of the north? Do we want the Battle of Bhopal to become the equivalent of the Battle of Gettysburg? That is the political implication of the scenario that is being presented to us. And I'd like you to think about it. At the same time, we are, I think, endangering ourselves by continuing to have a very hostile relationship with all our neighbors. If you look around, in Maldives, we have a Prime Minister whose election slogan was India out. He came into power and went to Turkey and China to show that Maldives was no longer a puppet of India's, and only then visited Delhi. In Sri Lanka, we have a former terrorist as the president, Anura Dissanayaka, and his JVP was the party of Buddhist Sinhala extremism. Now he's given it all up, but he's the same man, and he's the president. And extraordinarily, he's got several seats in Jaffna. So this extremist is reconciling with the Tamils, whereas he was fighting them in the 1980s. In Bangladesh, let me go to Burma first. In Burma, we had a friend in Aung San Suu Kyi, but now we have a regime there, a military regime, with which we hardly have a relationship. With Bangladesh, we put all our cards into Hasina's pack, and she went from being democratically elected to ruling dictatorially, and therefore the people came onto the streets. And now we are left with a regime which wants to be friendly with us, but with which we don't want to be friendly, and as a country which conducts daily atrocities against its own minorities. We're trying to kick up a big fuss about how they treat the Hindus. But investigations by the Bangladesh media, including the Daily Star and the Pratham Alo, which is the biggest Bengali newspaper, have shown that most of these so-called atrocities against Hindus is because Hindus on a big scale were supporters of the Awami League. Like the Muslims in India are determined opponents of the BJP. So is it because they are Awami Leaguers that these troubles are taking place, or because they are Hindus? We're not even asking that question. With Nepal, with Bhutan, let me begin there. With Bhutan, we have an excellent relationship, but just below the surface, there is tension. For China has borders with 14 countries. With 12 of them, they've settled the borders. There are only 2 countries with whom they haven't. One is India, and the other is Bhutan. And after Doklam, the Bhutanese are very keen on settling with China so that war doesn't break out on their border. It's we who are holding them back. So there is some unspoken tension. Nepal is the only country in the world with a Hindu majority. And its rajas were pups of the Gorakhpur Mutt, which is run by Yogi Adityanath. And therefore one would have imagined that we would have a good relationship with them. They greatly welcomed Mr. Modi when he became Prime Minister. But then by November of that year, 2014, when the SIRC summit was to be held in Kathmandu, Mr. Modi said that he wanted to stop in Janakpur on his way to, this is where Janaki, Sita, was born. So he said he wanted to stop in Janakpur. The Nepalese said, sure, you can. He then said, I'd like to do a public rally in Janakpur. They were a bit hesitant because it's a foreign country. But they agreed. And then he said he's going to distribute cycles to Nepalese girls at that rally. Why? Because there is a roti-beti rishta between Nepal and Bihar. And the state elections were coming up in Bihar. So the Nepalese said that this is not acceptable to us, that you play Indian electoral games in our country. So they cancelled his visit to Janakpur and insisted that he should come to Kathmandu directly. The result was that in the following year, just after a terrible earthquake, there was suddenly a constitutional agreement between all the political parties of Nepal, which hadn't taken place for 7 years. And they arrived at a constitution. And Mr. Modi sent Jaishankar, who was the foreign secretary, as his special envoy to Kathmandu to tell the Nepalese that they are not allowed to proclaim their new constitution because the new constitution does not contain the provisions which the Prime Minister of India felt the Nepalese should have in their constitution. So Jaishankar was described as a cursor. We have a very bad relationship with them. And of course we have a very, very, very bad relationship with Pakistan. And I want to end with a story that I have been asked to repeat here. So if some of you were here on a previous occasion and have heard the story, please forgive me for repeating it, but I'm doing it because I've been asked to. I arrived as India's first Consul General in Karachi in December, on the 14th of December, 1978. And to receive me at the airport was of course the protocol and the Indian consulate staff. But I was astonished that there was a representative of a businessman called Abdul Samad, who was a tobacco billionaire, also standing there. And he said to me as I got off the plane, but would I come and see Mr. Samad immediately? So I said, I come and see him, but at the moment I just arrived. So I set myself up, and then 4 or 5 days later, I went to see Samad. And Samad's house was a palace, and it looked like an AVM film set. And there was a standard woman with a pot, wearing a flimsy sari, out of which was pouring the water. That was in the center. There was a big driveway. And I went into the house with Samad, and there was a large number of young women lined up on the right side, and a large number of young men lined up on the left side. And as I was introduced to this avenue of Samad's family, it turned out that all of them were either sons and daughters-in-law of Samad or daughters and sons-in-law of Samad. But whether they were sons-in-law or daughters-in-law, they were all from Chennai. And here I was in Karachi. So when we sat down, I said to him, why have you married all your children to Indians? And his reply was, because I am an Indian. So I thought to myself, how can a Pakistani billionaire be an Indian? So I asked him to tell me his story. His story was that he was 17 years old when partition took place, and his father had a business in tobacco, snuff and so forth. So they had a Hindu agent in Sankar, which is a town in Sindh. And in the partition riots, the Hindu agent of the Tamil Nadu firm, or really the Trichy firm, had fled from Pakistan and gone to Indore. So Samad had been sent by his family as a 17-year-old boy to look after the retail trade. Then came partition, and he became a Pakistani citizen. But there was no problem at all, because he could easily import these tobacco requirements from Chennai and remit the money for that. When in September 1949, the pound sterling was devalued vis-a-vis the US dollar. And India followed suit, because we were honorable members of the sterling area. So he devalued the rupee. But the Pakistanis, being the perverse Pakistanis that they are, despite being in the sterling area, refused to devalue the Pakistani rupee. So Nehru, furious, broke off all trade between India and Pakistan. And when this happened, incidentally, Mohanlal Saxena, the Indian Minister of Refugees, he closed down all the Muslim shops in Jama Masjid. And when Nehru asked him why, he said, well, you've stopped trade with Pakistan, so I've stopped the trade of these Muslim traders. So that is the extent to which all these matters are mixed up one with the other. Anyway, Samad then found that he had no business to conduct. So he applied to the Indian High Commission for a passport. And the Indian High Commission informed him that since he had a Pakistani passport, he couldn't be given Indian citizenship. So Samad wrote to his parents here and said that I can't come because they're saying I can't get an Indian passport. So they were funding Kamaraj and the whole of the Congress party. They were their biggest financiers. So Kamaraj fetched up in Delhi, and he told told Jawaharlal Nehru that if Samad is not an Indian, then we will also not be Indians. And given the history of Tamil Nadu vis-a-vis the Union of India, Nehru got completely alarmed and ordered Rafi Ahmed Kidwai to do something about it, with the result that a letter was sent to the Indian High Commission in Karachi saying, notwithstanding Samad having taken Pakistani citizenship, as an exception, he could be given an Indian passport. So a letter arrived, and Samad went happily in the direction of the Indian High Commission, only to be told by the Pakistan tax authorities that if you switch your nationality from Pakistani to Indian, then we are going to put such a large tax demand on you that your entire firm will be bankrupted. So Samad hesitated from going to the Indian High Commission, and Samad then says to me that I knew I could only be saved by one man. So I asked him, because although partition had taken place, there were still considerable post-partition contacts between India and Pakistan. So Appa's firm, which was handling the Dalmias, who had a cement factory in Karachi, they were constantly going across to Karachi. So Samad sent for this Indian chartered accountant, and he said that whenever the man arrived in Karachi, there would be a line of Pakistani tax officers waiting with their files to get this Indian's advice on how to handle their complicated tax problems, and he was not giving my case enough time. So he said, but nevertheless I knew he was the only one who could save me, so I continued paying him. And then he said one morning, I opened the newspapers and I found that he'd been killed in an air accident. So I said, you're talking about my father. He said, oh, Mani Sankar Aiyar. So you are Sankar Aiyar's son? I said, yes. So he said, the minute your father died, I knew that nobody else could solve my problem. And so I decided to remain a Pakistani. So even in death, my father provided a billionaire to Pakistan. That is the story that I was asked to recount. And it shows the human links that we have between India and Pakistan. And I've never been able to understand why we are enemies with a country which is so friendly. I went to Pakistan, my first job there, the very first job. I told you that I arrived at the airport and Samad's representative was there to meet me. I then went to my office. The whole building, which is a huge building, was being repaired. So all of us, from my driver to me, were sitting in one room with one telephone between us. That telephone rang. It's my first hour in Pakistan. The telephone rang and my clerk who picked it up, rather embarrassed, confused, said, sir, this is a call for you from the office of the Deputy Commissioner of SIRC. So I picked it up very intrigued, because in normal diplomatic practice, civil servants don't call embassies directly. Anyway, I picked up the phone and there was a voice at the other end saying, sir, this was all in Urdu or Hindustani, but I'm going to say it in English. He said, sir, I have been appointed the liaison officer to the Hindu sadhu who has come to Pakistan because L.K. Advani, who had visited Pakistan the previous month, had asked the Pakistani authorities to allow this Hindu sant to come to Upper Sindh, where there is a fairly large Hindu population, to give them spiritual instruction. And the Pakistanis had agreed to that. Ziaul Haq would agreed to that. And this guy was appointed as his liaison officer. And the man came, he was living in an island called Sarbela, near Sankar. And I said, well, what's the problem? So he said, sir, I don't know what to do. So I had to press him, what's your problem? He said, the Muslim followers of your Hindu saint want to meet him. So I said, yes. He said, sir, will you give me permission to bring the Muslim murids to meet your Hindu son? And I rather grandly said, yes, of course you can do so. It was my first job in Pakistan. It showed where we are. It showed that where we are is where we were until this madness of partition took place. So if instead of concentrating on the Pakistani state, we were to concentrate on the Pakistani people, I lived in Karachi for 3 years, and in the last 40 years, or 43 years that I've been away from Pakistan, I've been back to Pakistan 40 times. And until they die, my Pakistani friends remain my Pakistani friends. When my daughters got married, we had 43 visitors from Pakistan. What is the problem in dealing with the people who, when we go to Birmingham or New York, we tend to make best friends with, allies against the whites? The Indians and the Pakistanis are always together. And yet, when it comes to our own subcontinent, neither can they come here nor can we go there. It's such a shame. And I think my father's example with Abdul Samad shows that we can have a better foreign policy than we actually have. I'm sorry that these remarks have gone on for perhaps longer than Dr. Subba Rao's lecture, but I was led into this trap by one of our friends who's sitting opposite me. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for honoring my father's memory. And above all, thank you, sir, for having accepted our invitation. Thank you, Venkatraman, for having suggested Dr. Subba Rao as the lecturer. And thank you, Mr. Soundarajan, and your colleagues for having organized this event. And after your elections, I trust the new president, and I think I'm spotting somebody in the audience who may be the new president, will be able to continue this series of lectures. Thank you.
Let's wait for a couple of minutes. Having heard two great intellectual people here, having given intellectual rains in the last 2 hours. Last 2 days we have been having torrential rains. The last 2 hours we had intellectual rains from two of the most eminent IAS officers which we could boast of from our side. First of all, let me thank Sankar Aiyar sir to have traced the reason for how this Sankar Aiyar lecture has been done, how he was able to share his thoughts process in here. So thank you very much, sir, for sharing your valuable thoughts. And this thanks can be with a lot of applauses also, please. And of course, we had Mr. Subba Rao sir opening up in a beautiful way by raising one pertinent question and having the more pertinent answers and having been able to conclude in a proper manner that it only in collective wisdom and collective methodology of intellectual system between the state and central that nation can improve. Definitely, it is a very great thought, sir. Let me see also to dream for a couple of minutes and try to find out 4 or 5 items. Definitely, in that 4 or 5 items, as you rightly said, that was not there. So it's a true fact. Thank you very much for your thought process, sir. Definitely, we would not have had a better lecture, memory lecture than this, because it had both foreign Indian policy and also your financial fiscal discipline. Both has been coming here. So beyond this, definitely for a memory lecture, we can't expect anything more. Thank you very much, sir, for your valuable thoughts. Let me thank the SIRC for continuously having this organizing this lecture. Thanks to the election code of conduct, I am sitting here in the presence of some other office bearers who will be normally coming up. I had an opportunity. Thank you very much to the SIRC for having invited me to have a formal vote of thanks. Thank you very much. Let's part with. Thank you.
Stand up for the anthem.
Yes, sir. We'll raise up for national anthem.
जनगण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड उत्कल गंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तव जय गाथा जन गण मंगल दायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे